Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today, it's great to have Lilianna Mason on the podcast. Mason is Associate Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, and author of Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity, with University of Chicago Press. She received her PhD in political psychology from Stony Brook University and her BA in politics from Princeton University. Her research on partisan identity, partisan bias, social sorting, and American social polarization has been published in journals such as American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, and Political Behavior, and featured in media outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and National Public Radio. Dr. Mason, what an honor it is to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
When you were writing this book, did you ever imagine just how relevant it would be to June 13th, 2020?
Yeah, I actually started writing this book in 2009 because it was my dissertation. And so I kind of came up with the idea of this when we were sort of still in the hope change, early Obama time. And we still had plenty of, clearly partisan animosity, but I was trying to explain that, but I certainly didn't know how bad it would get in the future.
Yeah. You talk in the book, I thought it was really interesting. You talked about hope leaders and fear leaders. I hadn't seen that distinction in the literature. That's a real distinction that people have noted throughout the course of human leadership?
I mean, not really. This is more thinking about the work on sort of emotions and behavior. And then thinking about sort of how leaders can manipulate the emotions of the electorate in order to sort of get the outcome that they want. And Obama is a great example of someone who's leading with hope and enthusiasm, whereas Trump is a better example of someone who leads with more sort of anger, anxiety, those types of emotions.
It's interesting. Your book really talks about these different perspectives and just trying to understand where different people are coming from. And you made a statement like, well, things are so bad. I imagine there's Trump supporters listening to this podcast that don't see it as bad. They see the other side as bad. And I'm just wondering, how can we get out of this quagmire where we talk to each other?
Yeah, I used to make a joke when I would go give talks about the book. People would say, how do we get out of this? And I would joke, if aliens were to attack Earth, then maybe we would all come together as, human beings, and we would have this superordinate identity, at least as Americans, right? To defeat this clearly outside force that had a common goal. But, I think the closest that you can come to that actually happening in reality is sort of COVID.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. Yeah. And what we've seen is that the way we have responded to it has been to politicize it. And that makes it very difficult to even react or make productive changes. And that actually is a great demonstration of how I think really dangerous polarization can be. If everything is politicized, then the point of every decision is for your party to win, not for people to, everyone in the country to do well and survive.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, can you ever think I can try to think of any point that I've been alive where the predominant focus I've saw in politics was on uplifting common humanity. I mean, that should be the goal, but I can't remember it ever existing. Can you?
I think the closest that we've come to that was actually criticized. This was in 1950. The American Political Science Association editors wrote a letter for their annual meeting, which they always do. But in 1950, the letter said, we need the parties to be more distinguishable. They're too close to each other. Voters don't have clear information because the two parties basically look the same. And so we need more polarization to give voters a better cue about which side they should vote for. They just there's no difference right now. And it wasn't that that both parties were sort of working for the common good, but actually they were so similar to each other at that point in time that there wasn't a lot of information for voters about which party was best for them, and kind of either one would have been fine, particularly for white voters at that period of time.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that wasn't in my lifetime or yours. I
No.
gather.
Yeah.
Well, what a time. What a time. And you make some important distinctions I think might help people frame various issues today and see it in a lot clearer. One interesting distinction you make is between social polarization and policy polarization. Was there was a time when they were more aligned? Is that right? Than we see today?
So really what it is that as political scientists, we have thought about polarization as a divide between policy preferences. And so, for instance, when people measure polarization within Congress, they look at how everyone voted on various bills and see, how far are Republicans from Democrats on average in each of these bills that they vote for. So the assumption has always been that the way to measure polarization is to look at issue preferences and policy preferences. The problem is that a lot of Americans have very conflicting issue and policy preferences. The average American is generally to the left of center in their policy preferences across a range of issues, but also, more Americans call themselves conservatives than call themselves liberals. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of what Americans understand about ideology and policy and what the government does. And so as I was starting this project, what I was thinking was, we know things about intergroup conflicts that can predict outcomes where groups really hate each other. And that has nothing to do with what a government does. It has nothing to do with the policy preferences of the people in the groups. A lot of the time, it's just very basic, human psychology reasons for having intergroup conflict, and that hadn't really been applied to political party at that point, with like one exception. And so that to me, it was hard to make the argument, right? Because political scientists don't want to think that democracy is a bunch of people making kind of team-oriented, just like lashing out type choices in their votes. They want to think that voters are thoughtful and rational and making, the choice that is the best for the most people. That's what democracy is supposed to be. But it really turns out it's not that way. And so if you separate these two concepts, it becomes a lot easier to understand what's going on in American politics.
Well, it's not a surprise to me as someone who studied narcissism and self-esteem and what happens when our ego is threatened in some way, or identity and an identity's ego, so to speak, is threatened. It seems like everyone's threatening everyone's identity, ego right now.
Yeah, this goes back even just to, the minimal group paradigm experiments of social identity theory from Tajfel in the 1970s.
Love that stuff.
That stuff. It's first of all, it's extremely reproducible. And it's also it demonstrates a very simple idea, which is basically that even in the weakest group identity, right? Someone just told you that you're in a group and you don't know any other group members and you're never going to meet them. Even in that scenario, people still privilege, if they have to allocate money to people still privilege their own group's victory over the greater good scenario, even in that weak identity. So we should expect it to continue to happen as identities grow stronger and stronger. But that is a real challenge for democracy. If everyone who feels a social attachment to a party prefers partisan victory, even at a loss to their own party, overall, but if they're, they get less, but they get more than the other side. If they prefer that to the sort of overall greater good of the nation, that's not going to work out for democracy. There's not
for the nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some real threats to democracy right now. There's no way of sugarcoating that, right?
No.
I maybe would have sugarcoated it 7 years ago, but I feel like there's just no way of sugarcoating that right now. Yeah.
I think we were sugarcoating it 7 years ago. I think I was even sugarcoating it in the concluding chapter of my book. I was, trying to find a way for there to be a happy ending where everything's okay. And it doesn't seem to be fixable. I think my only optimism right now is sort of the reckoning with racial justice that we're having at this point. This to me is the only possible path forward for democracy to function. The only possible way is for us as a nation to sort of rip off the Band-Aid of this legacy of white supremacy, because what's happened is the parties have become divided along the lines of, does racism exist? And that is sort of the new sort of deepest cleavage between the parties is, does systemic racism exist in America? And has it been existing, forever? And effectively, our parties have divided on this idea. So if we don't sort of hash out this question, it's going to be hard for us to cooperate or really talk honestly through any other problem.
I agree. And this is something I found really elucidating in your book, is talking about how different political parties have become more socially homogenous, and in these different clusters that we now see together, where you have like multiple identities clustered together, which give power to an identity, to a particular identity. If you have, 3-4 different, like religion, race, gender, you see these things all clustered together under party lines. You can have a very powerful force for good or bad on both sides. But can you tell me actually how we're seeing that social homogeny right now?
So the data basically show, for a long time, we've been seeing the Republican Party becoming sort of more white and more evangelical in particular. Recently, in recent years, I would say, not even like before Trump, increasingly becoming rural, whereas Democrats are more urban, and then suburban people are in the middle somewhere. And sort of place-based identity can be a real, actual strong identity if it's being threatened. The gender gap is increasing, so women tend to be Democrats more than men, and then Democrats are this really large coalition of non-white, non-evangelical, sort of everyone else, right? Where it's the people who live in really diverse areas. That's where the Democrats tend to be, and so really what we have is kind of this, both a rural-urban divide. We have increasingly an education-based divide. In 2016 was the very first time that class was not a dividing factor between the parties. Like they were equally working class versus middle class. And that's partially because we used to have education and income are obviously correlated. But we used to have both of those pointing in the same direction, where more highly educated people and more wealthy people were Republican. And in 2016, that changed so that more highly educated people were Democrats and more highly income people were still Republicans. So the total effect of class is sort of canceled out in 2016. And we don't know if that's just going to stay there or if it's going to like cross so that we end up with these sort of different coalitions now.
Look, that's really interesting. Like I kind of want to zoom in on that a second, because you're seeing almost like, and correct me if I'm just talking absolute nonsense, but it almost seems like we're seeing on the Trump party lines a lot of low income white people feeling aggrieved, and on the Democrat lines you have a lot of African Americans, low income, maybe same income line, but African American identity, just African American, feeling aggrieved. So yes, you're right. It doesn't seem like it's strictly about the class or the economics, but it does feel more and more racial.
Yeah.
I'm not talking nonsense, right?
No, not at all.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, this is the age-old problem of American, especially black-white relations in American history and society, is that poor white people have always been incentivized to discriminate against poor black people, so that they don't all gather together and rise up against the wealthy, right? Like it's.
Well, why don't they get together and there's more power in working together than divided, right?
Well, so this actually goes back to sort of the status thing that we're talking about, right? If you want people are willing to sacrifice as long as their group is better than the other group, right? And so the scenario, what W.B. Du Bois calls it, the wages of whiteness, where essentially poor white workers were given social status instead of a wage, instead of actual money, so that they felt themselves to be morally and biologically superior,
like entitled.
Yeah, but even in like reality, like they were actually like given better, schools, and they were given better access to, grocery stores and neighborhoods, and so the even if they're making the same amount of money, they have this social status that, particularly if they're not making a lot of money, they're very desperate to defend, right? If you lose that status, then you lose everything. And that's the only thing making you feel like you're, not at the bottom of the ladder in society. And so that divide, as long as we have poor white people feeling that they have this status advantage over poor black people, then there will not ever be a cooperation between them to improve everyone's economic outcomes.
Such a shame. It feels like they should bond more with each other. Like, you all have a lot in common. Like, couldn't we have a leader that kind of inspires them all to, kind of see each other in each other?
That's possible. It's certainly, right. Leaders certainly can divide people. So it could be possible that we could have a leader that found a way to kind of cross that barrier. The problem is, I really think the problem is deeply psychological, though. Because we value...
That's why you're on the psychology podcast.
We value our status more than we value money.
Wow.
And because it's such a core part of our self-esteem, and that we are ready to defend at all costs. You can't live a life without feeling that you have some esteem, right, in some way in your life. And so people are, there's a book called Dying of Whiteness that measured health outcomes for white people in areas where, largely that were led by, sort of Republican, very conservative, small government type of leaders and lots of those types of voters. And they were losing years off of their lives because of the decisions they were making, largely because they don't want black people to get those things, right? If you give everyone health care, then black people get health care just as much as white people get health care. And then where's that status? They don't have any more, then they're not different from the black people.
To me, why that sounds a bit illogical is that black people are people. The thing is, like, we're all people, and you have people who are white, and it's like, yeah, I want to help other poor white people. I want to help them, but I don't want to help black poor people. But you're all people and you're all poor. So it kind of boggles my mind, that way of thinking.
We kind of made a deal to decide that black people were not people as soon as we enslaved them.
Yeah, well, that's what it is,
right? And so you had to have a whole lot of motivated reasoning and psychological work that people had to do to convince themselves that black people were not people for hundreds of years. And it hasn't been hundreds of years since that. And so, it was 400 years of slavery. We haven't even approached half that time since the end of slavery, and certainly not since the end of Jim Crow. So we spent a lot of time, really embedding the idea that black people were not people in the minds of white Americans. And that takes time to change. And it's also just a very simple cue, right? Like it's not hard to tell. It's not like a Catholic and a Protestant, hating each other on sight, because maybe there are some visual cues in the way people look, but in general, the ways, the sort of that type of religious divide is different than a black-white divide, which is very visible. And in fact, the political scientist Michael Tesler has written a lot about this, how the Obama presidency was sort of the impetus for a lot the sort of remaining poor white Democrats to leave the Democratic Party, just because they weren't paying attention to politics. They weren't, watching politics on TV. They weren't reading about politics. But the simple cue of, what the president looked like told them that they didn't belong in that party. And so it was nothing Obama said or did. It was just the simple fact of his face being on the front of the newspaper that they walked by on their way to work.
So that's literally it, like the color of his skin.
Yeah, it's very easy to see. And so for people who otherwise are not paying attention to anything, it's a very it's the simplest, maybe except for gender, it's the simplest cue. Maybe even more than gender, actually.
I'm excited to announce that the Psychology Podcast now has a Patreon page. You're going to love our new exclusive episodes just for Patreon subscribers. There'll be about a couple a month that only will be accessible if you subscribe through Patreon. Also, there will be all sorts of tiers that will give you the opportunity to not only access Patreon-only episodes, but you also get an opportunity to join the community, ask your own questions of new guests, and even have a 30-minute Skype call with me each month. Also, if we reach our monthly goal, we will donate 10% of all proceeds to an organization dedicated to helping people with their mental health. Check out our Patreon page today by going to patreon.com/psychpodcast. That's patreon.com/psychpodcast. Okay, now back to the show. You know, when I was reading your book, you talked about George Washington's frightful despotism, and I was just so taken back by, if he was alive today, he would say he would be frightful, don't you think?
I think he'd be furious.
Yeah. Can you explain to our listeners, like, just remind them what frightful despotism
Yeah, so
is?
in Washington's farewell address, he specifically warned Americans not to form political parties that they grew very attached to. Because if they did that, then first of all, they wouldn't care about America as a whole anymore. It provides an opportunity for foreign interests. He specifically said for foreign interests to divide us against each other. It provides an opportunity for people who want to meddle with the success of American democracy to have a very natural, place to try to start dividing Americans and damaging American democracy. And he specifically warned against this and saying that, if we have these partisan identities, that, it will take on a life of its own. It will become frightful. And then the following election, they created two parties.
And then the rest is history.
The Constitution didn't plan for parties. They assumed that the largest fights that we would be having would be between big states and small states. That's the way the Constitution was built, to make sure that we could balance between big states and small states. And it just didn't think about parties at all. And so a lot of our problems assumed that rational people would make the best choice. The reason we have the Electoral College, for instance, is that the founders didn't trust the electorate to make the best choices. There may be a demagogue who comes along sometime and convinces people to support him, even if he's not necessarily the best candidate for America. And in that case, the Electoral College was supposed to change the will of America. That was the reason that they're there. They're supposed to overturn the popular vote, the entire purpose of it. And so, but what they didn't see coming was that partisanship would make it so that no one is going to change their vote in the Electoral College, even if they think the candidate is a bad candidate, because they need that victory.
Were people in Washington's day in politics, were they more thoughtful and reasonable and cordial? What was different?
Well, the first thing to note is that in that period of time, it was only white landowning men who were allowed to vote.
Okay, so in that sense, yes, you're right, yeah.
So the people that they were most worried about making bad choices were white landowning men who maybe were uneducated or unsophisticated in some way. And that's whose vote the Electoral College would overturn. So that to begin with, that was a very small electorate. And then, I think during Washington's time, there were a lot of Enlightenment ideas, right? They were trying to create a new type of government. And so there were sort of lofty ideals being thrown around, but by people who owned slaves and understood that, all are not created equal as long as you think of, Black human beings as not human beings.
Yeah.
So there was there's a deep paradox at the core of American democracy that we've never really dealt with. But I think that they had lofty ideas. They just they didn't really live them out, and I'm not sure anyone really has fully lived them out since then.
You talk now about how there's a lot of emotion-driven action. Why are we so emotional, and why do emotions matter?
Appraisal theory first. So that basically says if you're feeling threatened, and you know the source of your threat, you know where the threat is coming from, then you feel angry. And anger is an approach emotion, so we should expect you to then go into action. If you feel threatened and you don't know where the threat is coming from, you don't understand the source of your threat, that will lead to anxiety. And anxiety is a withdrawal emotion. So you, instead of approaching, you move away and think about what to do. And so the idea is that anger should drive people into action, and anxiety should actually pull them back from action. So one really easy way for a leader, for instance, to make people angry rather than anxious is to say, hey, I know you're all feeling really threatened and sort of uncertain in these crazy times. I'm going to tell you who to blame, whether it's true or not. And as soon as I tell you who to blame, then you can become angry. And then you can go participate in politics and take action. And to some degree, that's what Trump did with the kind of Trump base. He took a bunch of people who were feeling just sort of ill at ease with the way society was going, with the way they felt they were being treated by the, kind of like liberal elites, with, the liberalization of our sort of moral society, and also bad economic times and economic challenges and the hollowing out of rural America. Sort of all of these things mixed together created a sense of something's not right. I think a lot of people didn't know where to place that feeling of discomfort and threat. And so to have a leader come along and say, it's the immigrants, you should be building a wall to stop them from coming in, and then you'll feel better. And so now you know who to attack. You know who's the bad guy. It's the immigrants. And so then everyone feels, instead of anxious and uncertain, they feel very certain and ready to go. And he mobilized people who weren't previously voting by kind of converting these sort of uncertain people into very certain, very angry, and very motivated people.
I think probably the major question is what's going to happen this next election now that people have seen the truth, and I think America will really be tested in a big way with this next election. So this is a very, first of all, very uncertain answer to the question. And also it is a very risky time. I think that it's a time that there's an opportunity for a lot of really big changes, but we don't know which way those changes are going to go. So the project that I'm working on now with Nathan Kalmo at LSU is a second book on sort of how far can partisanship go to not just make people dislike each other, but even dehumanize and all the way up to approve of violence against people on the other side and people in the other party. So we're also looking at what happens when an election is delegitimized, when the outcome of an election is not considered legitimate by large portions of people. And so far, what we've found is that there's sort of, there's like 5 to 15% of Americans, and we've done like 7-8 surveys at this point measuring these same things. Generally 5 to 15% of partisans who are willing to advocate for political violence against the other party, including against regular people in the electorate, not just party leaders. And that number kind of stays in that general realm. Now, if you think about, what is, let's say, 10% of partisans in America, we have millions and millions and millions of those people. But the main thing that we found is that they can be brought down from that attitude. So elite rhetoric really, really matters. So whatever leaders are saying, they can make people approve of violence less by saying something pacifying, and they can make people feel more approving of violence by saying something approving of violence. So something to pay a lot of attention to right now is what are our political leaders saying in terms of encouraging violence, encouraging the types of action that might be extremely damaging down the road after the election. Hey everyone, I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors, Helix Sleep. Are you not able to sleep lately because of stress and anxiety? It's definitely understandable, given the current state of the world. Psychological research shows that high-quality sleep is so important, though, for stress and well-being, and your choice of mattress really can matter a lot. In the past few years, I've been on a search for the perfect mattress, and let me tell you, I've gone through so many mattresses. But here's the thing, I had no idea what it feels like to be well rested until I tried a Helix mattress. Helix Sleep makes personalized mattresses right here in America and ships them straight to your door with free no-contact delivery, free returns, and a 100-night sleep trial. To choose a mattress, Helix made a quiz that takes just 2 minutes to complete and matches your body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for you. If you like a mattress that's really soft or firm, you sleep on your side or on your back or on your stomach, or you sleep really hot, with Helix there's a specific mattress for each and everybody's unique taste. I took the quiz and I was matched with the Helix Sunset Luxe because I wanted something that felt soft, and I sleep mostly on my side all night. I've got to say, I love my Helix mattress. I wake up with zero back and neck pain, which I had quite a bit of before. I wake up really feeling refreshed and ready to work out or start my work. I really do love Helix, but you don't have to take my word for it. Helix was awarded the #1 best overall mattress pick of 2020 by GQ, Wired Magazine, and Apartment Therapy. Just go to helixsleep.com/psychology, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress that will give you the best sleep of your life. They even have a 10-year warranty, and you get to try it out for 100 nights risk-free. Also, they'll even pick it up for you if you don't love it, but you probably will. Right now, Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders. Get up to $200 off at helixsleep.com/psychology. That's helixsleep.com/psychology. This is a really good deal. So get a new bed today and treat yourself. Okay, now back to the show. I thought it was really interesting how you talked about activism. You have a quote, you say, activism may have increased over the last few decades, but this is not necessarily a responsible outcome-based participation. Do you have any criticisms of current activism efforts?
No, I think it's more of an overall, in political science as a field, we tend to think about political action as a completely 100% normative good because we assume that people are acting rationally. And so the more people that are participating in politics, the better the electorate represents the whole country. And so we have a better and stronger democracy. So we have more people voting, that's more buy-in, that's more representation. That's just good, purely good for the American public. But like I said before with the anger issue, sometimes people participate in politics not because they've really thought through policy preferences and what they want the government to do, but instead because somebody just told them who to blame for all their problems, and so they just get up and run. And in that scenario, that's not normatively good participation, right? That's not necessarily representing a well-reasoned, policy agenda for the future of the federal government. Instead, it's really sort of just wild participation. And it's very hard, you can't just like draw a simple line to distinguish between those two things. But I really wanted to make the point that it's possible to have activism that isn't normatively good.
Yeah.
It's a sort of, that's a disputed claim, but that's my.
Well, I wonder if this relates at all to another point you made, which I thought was wonderful because it's just not pointed out that often. And that's that just because you have an in-group doesn't mean you have to hate your out-group. There can be healthy activism in the sense that you have great pride for your in-group. You want to fight for rights for your in-group, but that's what you're fighting for, not specifically to eradicate an out-group. So that somehow seems related to maybe different types of activism efforts.
Yeah, I think and that was a really important sort of part of the theory that was advanced by Marilyn Brewer in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is that in-group love is one part of an identity, and out-group hate is another part, and they don't always go together. Sort of the first instinct of social identity is to affiliate and to feel close to the people in your group and to hope that they are better than the other people, right? But not necessarily to hate the other people. And the hatred comes when there is either a conflict over resources between the groups, or if there has already become a complete lack of trust between the groups. Because then in that scenario, and this I think really is reflected in the COVID response, everyone says, like, let's have this superordinate threat, and then everyone, like a threat to all of America, and then Democrats and Republicans will work together. Well, but if Democrats and Republicans don't trust one another, they don't trust each other to address the threat in the right way, and they are fearful that the other side will address the threat in the wrong way and actually harm them. And so in that scenario, with a lack of trust, a superordinate threat can actually make the intergroup conflict worse.
Oh, oy vey.
Well, that's what we've seen. I mean, I know, but like, this is what we've seen in terms of responses to the sort of the virus recommendations.
Dr. Mason, why are humans so horrible to each other?
I don't think we're horrible.
I know. I'm kind of being cheeky because I'm a humanistic psychologist. I'm ultimately optimistic about humanity.
We're kind of a young species still, and it actually makes a lot of sense for us to form bonds with other people, and to create boundaries around where that group ends and another group begins. Right. The only way for us to have society is to understand, who you are as a part of that society, and who is like you in that society. And if you think back to sort of, like evolutionary psychology, in the like village days, there are, real boundaries between groups of people, geographical boundaries between groups of people. And it's important to know that you have loyalty to your group, and you're willing to defend your group. And families are like that. And any group of people that share something that they either want to maintain or that they feel is being threatened, they will behave that way. And that can be an honorable thing, or you can use it to destroy people. And you can use it to intentionally, as George Washington warned, you can use it to intentionally turn people against each other to harm an entire nation. And I think, we see that in election meddling, foreign election meddling. It doesn't take a whole lot to make Americans hate each other by putting some bots out there. We already hate each other, so you just have to really poke at that, and so it's a tool for good and for evil. And some people are, on an international level, would prefer that we don't exist, and we feel it, and that makes us behave really badly towards each other as Americans. Mm.
But, there's a point I just want to return to, which is the crux of your entire book. And I think it's encapsulated by this quote. American partisans can grow increasingly socially distant from one another, even if their policy disagreement are not profound. This gets at the, let's zoom in on basically, this is the crux of your work. So isn't there a glimmer of hope in that, Will, if we actually started shifting our focus to the things that we agree on, we may realize, wow, there's actually more here than meets the eye if we immediately start to hate someone?
I'm not as optimistic about that one, because okay. I actually so I'm going beyond the book. I replicated this with the 2016 election data, and still the average American is slightly to the left. If you average, their issue positions across like 6 really contentious issues. If you look at, how well Americans put their issues on, so if Democrats are on the liberal side of an issue or Republicans are on the conservative side of an issue, how correct are people, at holding the right issue positions? Generally, neither Democrats or Republicans are very good at sort of holding the correct issue positions for their party, or even just being on the right side of the middle. And so the 2016 electorate was one that actually there was plenty of room for people to collaborate on. There's so much overlap in what Americans actually think. And, America's not Twitter, right? Like, the average American who is asked questions about what they want government to do or what they think society should do, there's a huge amount of room for compromise in policy alone. But then you ask those same people how they felt, so asking Republicans how they felt about Democrats and vice versa, they hate each other. Even in the same survey, the same people in the same survey, they really hate the other the people in the other political party. Well, the other political party. And they also really love their own.
Wow.
So even in a single, set of respondents that has tons of issue-based overlap, they still really don't like the people on the other side. And that's, the policy agreement won't work until the social divide is addressed, I think. It's just too rational.
Well, Dr. Mason, I'm going to keep trying to get at hope here. You do mention in the psychological literature some things we know that might help with intergroup reconciliation. Let's, for the remainder of this podcast, just briefly touch on some of these things. So maybe we have some people listening in a position of policy or can make a change and they can adopt some of these principles. So one is contact theory. You say, while exposure to opposing political ideas and individuals can moderate intolerance and polarization, this exposure is growing far less frequent. How can we increase exposure across party lines?
One of the original studies on this was during the Korean War, the United States Armed Forces were desegregated, but it was done so battalion by battalion in almost random order. It was just wherever they needed more troops, they would desegregate that battalion. So it was sort of like a natural experiment. And sociologists interviewed all of these soldiers in both the desegregated and the still segregated battalions. And what they found was that the white soldiers in the desegregated battalions were much more racially tolerant than the white soldiers in the still segregated battalions. So that was a great example of, it's just contact. But it's not only contact, it's contact in a scenario in which the two groups are not competing over resources. They're not even competing over hierarchy, because those, the military hierarchy assignments are relatively strict. And so they just are what they are. And also they're all working towards a common goal.
The superordinate goals, as you talk about.
Right. Yeah. Which really only work if you have those other two things, though.
Yeah.
So one of the sort of like moonshot ideas that I think about is like a national service program where we intentionally move people to other parts of the country they wouldn't otherwise go, and expose them to people, like do mandatory gap year after high school and move kids into a place where they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to these people. And then that would give some sort of either tuition benefit or, it would become an honor. So you put it on your CV or your resume and it'd be easier to get hired. And then freshman year in college, ideally you could have some kind of like required debrief course where every freshman goes into the debrief and talks about what happened over the last year and how these sort of social relationships work, so that they can understand exactly what happened to them and be more aware, kind of more mindful about the way they think about other people and the way they judge other people in general. That, I think, would be the most ideal way to educate sort of the next generation of Americans.
You're seeing some hopeful snapshots of protests on the news where you see like the police and the protesters doing the boogie dance together. You see these flickers of moments. I don't know what positive that is going to be, but they warm my heart when I see such things, or you see, just people who they're supposed to hate, they're told they're supposed to hate each other, and that they just put it down for a second and decide we're just not going to hate each other for a second. Like I see these glimmers.
Yeah. Honestly, one of the things that gives me the most hope is the diversity of the protesters.
I've noticed that too. Yeah.
It's people compare this to 1968 all the time. It's very different from 1968 because these protests are very, very diverse. And that's
what Spike Lee said when he was interviewed recently. Yeah. He's like, it's amazing the difference.
It's huge. And honestly, what it's bringing up is not just police reform, but a call for Americans, white Americans in particular, to understand that Black Americans have been living under a different type of state than white Americans have been living under. And what we've seen recently in recent years before the protests, starting in 2015, is that white Democrats have been becoming a lot more aware of systemic racism over the sort of Trump presidency. And it's massive. It's something like, people who agree that the government needs to do more to help Blacks in American society. That goes from 40-something% of white Democrats to 80-something% of white Democrats by 2019. So there's really big changes happening among white Democrats in particular about awareness of what's happening to Black Americans in our in our society. And, the fact that we're seeing Confederate statues come down now, right? That's not about police. That's about saying the Civil War never really ended, or at least the Confederacy was never fully defeated, because all of these laws were put in place to truly hold back Black Americans. And I really do think that part of the reason we can say this now is that this has never happened before. There's an entire political party that believes that systemic racism exists. The Democratic Party, like the white people and everybody else in the Democratic Party, basically believe that systemic racism exists. And we have never had an entire political party that believes that before. We've always had sort of white supremacists scattered through both the Republican and Democratic parties. And there wasn't a big difference. And that's part of the reason they could get along and make compromises, right? In the 1980s, Democrats and Republicans could make compromises because they all agreed that okay, we'll do this, but only for white people. And so this sort of suppression of the knowledge of systemic racism allowed a lot of cooperation in Congress. But that doesn't help. That doesn't help us as in the society as a whole. And so I really think that a large part of this is that because the parties have changed socially, the social and demographic makeup of the parties has changed so much in recent decades, that is allowing a lot more political power than has ever been applied to the idea that systemic racism exists, it's bad, and it should be ended.
It would be really nice if everyone could rally around facts and not just ideologies, and we agreed. We agree this is factually a problem. We don't agree that there's a problem, that we could somehow come towards some sort of agreement on some of these things. But because there's widely different opinions on the extent of the systemic racism, and I don't think there's a definitive answer. I just read a really fascinating article by someone I really respect, John McWhorter, who is a African American, I believe, conservative, talking about saying there really isn't good data that the police force is racist. There's a problem, but we could all rally around the problem of police corruption, regardless of your race. There's a lot of white people killed by police, and there's not so some reasonable people, and I would not say John McWhorter is racist, just for presenting a different viewpoint. Yeah. How do we listen to different viewpoints and try to agree on facts?
So I think it's really important for us to keep in mind the difference between a person being racist and a society systematically disadvantaging a group of people, right? It's not that one person is racist. It's that, we had redlining so that Black families were not allowed into neighborhoods, and we had neighborhood organizations that didn't allow Black families to buy houses in those neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods were the ones with the good schools. And this was happening not even, 50 years ago. So this is happening in my dad's generation. And so this is, I think that the idea is not that we're pointing fingers at people and saying you're a racist. It's that racism has existed in American society since the very beginning. And we've been on this sort of constant journey to try to eliminate it in the system, not even just in individual people's minds, but just to change redlining became illegal in the 60s. So racial discrimination is technically illegal starting in 1964. But that was 1964. That was not very long ago. And then there are plenty of people in charge who are still upholding that old system of systemic racism. So it's, I think it's a really important thing for people to separate the idea of being called racist and understanding our society and the institutions upon which we live, right? And I do think there is one bit of hope, is that we have also seen white Republicans becoming slightly more aware of systemic racism and also holding fewer negative stereotypes of Black Americans. So Republicans are also becoming more aware of this. It's just that the gap between white Democrats and white Republicans is still very large. But the changes are happening in both parties. So there is a general move toward understanding sort of the discrimination that Black Americans face on a day-to-day basis, and the idea that we shouldn't hold these negative stereotypes that there are not stereotype-based differences between white and Black Americans.
So interesting. You see my point, how people really are not agreeing right now on even the extent of the various aspects of American society are systemically racist. Even people might say that the racism does exist and acknowledge that, but there seems to be quite wild disagreement. Even within the Democratic Party, I see lots of arguments on Twitter. Even within the Democrat, some people will say, "How dare you even question that it's pervasive?" And then they immediately start hating each other without even discussing it.
It's a very threatening thing to admit, right?
Yeah.
If you're a white person who's been living in a society that has been benefiting you and harming other people, at your you've been benefited at the expense of this other group of people. That's a hard thing to take on as just an.
Well, John McWhorter is Black, the guy who wrote that.
Yeah. But it is a whole philosophy, and the difference. I think historians generally agree, right? Like the historians of American history agree that of American political history agree that we have had a systemically racist system since the founding. The question is, right, obviously it was systemically racist when people were enslaved. And then once they were no longer enslaved, we had 8 years of Reconstruction, in which there were a lot of Black really successful and thriving Black communities that were built, and then they were literally murdered by white supremacists, and we bombed them. Like the white society destroyed those communities as soon as they were successful. And then that led to an era of Jim Crow, in which white people and Black people weren't allowed to use the same water fountains. And that was only made illegal in 1964. And Black people were really only allowed to vote in 1965. So, think about the age of your parents in that year. We're not very far away from that. And it takes, if we have 400 years of slavery, it's going to take a lot more time than 50 years to undo that much psychological training, right? It's not a question of, do I think this is true? Do I, what is my experience of it? The question is actually just historically what has happened. What have been the priorities of our government? What have been the priorities of our institutions, and like how people have been treated? And that historians are pretty clear on that.
Let's take a brief pause as I talk about one of our sponsors, Care Of. Care Of is a wellness brand that makes it easy to maintain your health goals with a customized vitamin plan that helps you feel your best today and supports you long term. Let's face it, the vitamin aisle can be really confusing. It's hard to know what you need and where to start. Their service is really hassle-free, as they deliver vitamins and supplements directly to you. Care Of can make taking your vitamins and supporting your health goals attainable. Their easy online quiz helps you find the vitamins and powders that will support your specific health goals, like improving your fitness routine or managing stress. Care Of is focused on the quality, science, and research that goes into each of their products and recommendations. And they make health easy thanks to their online quiz. You can go on their website and take a short online quiz and answer some questions about your diet, health goals, and lifestyle. And Care Of will recommend a list of vitamins and supplements specifically for your health needs and goals. I took the fun quiz and answered questions such as, how much sleep do you get? How often do you work out? And do you follow any specialty diets? They recommended that I take fish oil, magnesium, ashwagandha, and some other supplements to help regulate my stress levels throughout the day and keep my heart healthy. I can say that after using their convenient packets for just a few days, I'm feeling much better during my day and I feel much more energy. For 50% off your first Care Of order, go to takecareof.com and enter code psychology50. Again, for 50% off your first Care Of order, go to takecareof.com and enter code psychology50. This is a really good deal, and you don't want to miss out on it. Okay, now back to the show. What I always try to do, I really appreciate your perspective. What I always try to do in the psychology podcast is always constantly trying to think of alternative, like what would someone else say to what you're saying? So
yeah,
that's why I'm trying to push you a little bit, because some people, make arguments that 2020, we've really come a long way, even in 30, 40 years, and that we focus so much on how we haven't come that we very rarely talk about how far we have actually come. And some people might make that point.
No, that's true. And we have come a remarkably far way, right? I mean, just the, like we said, the demographics of the demonstrators that we've been seeing in all of these cities, right? We've clearly come a long way. But we also are still taking down Confederate monuments. So,
Yeah.
those weren't there right after the Civil War, because the Confederacy was a rebellion against the country. They were the enemy. And so, they were against the Union. So they were actually the bad guys. And those statues went up during Jim Crow to put Black people in those communities back in their place, and to remind them that the people who made the decisions about where statues went and what the statues were believed in the Confederacy. So the fact that we still have those statues, to me, suggests that there's still something very deep that is we've all just sort of, we look past it. We walk past the statues, and white people don't have to worry about it. We just walk past it and don't worry. But it means something really, really different. And that's sort of, kind of this crazy thing. NASCAR has prohibited the Confederate flag at NASCAR events. And I think it was U.S. Marines just made it no longer allowed for Marines to have a Confederate flag, sticker on their, whatever equipment. And the flag of the Confederacy was a flag of treason. The idea that we have a military group that had for a while allowed its soldiers to have this flag that was based on, treason against America, is really remarkable. So we've come a really long way. You're right. And these protests and demonstrations, I think, are really great evidence of that. But at the same time, if we're still flying the Confederate flag at sporting events, that's a signal. That's a really clear signal to a lot of people.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is the last hopeful thing we can do. Change it. We talked about contact theory. We talked about superordinate. Social norms. You say one way that outright partisan prejudice may be addressed is for the parties themselves to establish new norms for partisan behavior. Could you see a new leader coming to power, or even our current leader somehow completely changing his whole style overnight?
Definitely not the current leader. He's not well known for controlling the language that he uses. But certainly, I think leadership does matter. Even going back to our parents' generation, right? The use of derogatory racial slurs in our parents' generation was much more widespread than it is today. And now we just find it completely socially acceptable to say horrible things about political partisans on the other side. It's completely socially acceptable for us to, call liberals or Democrats, awful words, and the same thing for Republicans and conservatives. So, that to me seems like a norm that could be challenged. It's certainly anti-democratic, and the idea that we're just allowing people, not allowing, you can't control what people say, but the way that we changed the use of derogatory racial slurs is that we made it a norm that's not okay to do that. And so it's possible that the way that we talk about each other as Democrats and Republicans could shift if we wanted it to, right? If we wanted to create new norms around the way that we talk about each other politically, that could potentially shift behavior. Have that type of language not be seen on, news or public media or any type of popular media. Because right now it's so much more acceptable to use these really awful words against Democrats and Republicans than it is about any other group at all.
Agreed. And it gets you more likes on Twitter among your fan base or your in-group if you use such words.
Well, and Newt Gingrich, so in 1994, Newt Gingrich wrote what's called the GOPAC memo, which was a list of words that you should use this was for freshman Republicans in the new 1995 Congress, where they first took over Congress. The Republicans took over Congress for the first time in 40 years. And he gave them a list of words that they should be using to talk about Republicans. And those were patriotic, loyal, family, and then words that should be used to talk about Democrats. And those were things like poison, cancer, evil, serpent, just really terrible language. And that really...
Are serpents bad?
Yeah, I think like in the Bible.
Okay. I think serpents are cool. Anyway, okay. But yeah, point taken.
So that I think that sort of did usher in a new era of like, oh, we're supposed to talk about people this way, right? Newt Gingrich told us that we could do that, so we're allowed to do this. We're allowed to say these terrible things.
As I was looking at your book, I was like, is there any good news at all? And I found one thing, and maybe let's just leave on this. You talked about the importance of self-affirmation. People want to, there's so much ego threat going on right now, and everyone wants to matter. I mean, everyone, you see it. You see a desperate cry, I saw, this protest in England, 3 people with white people matter signs. like everyone wants to matter. You wrote, the good news is that Cohen et al. 2007 have found that simply reminding a person of their own self-worth, a technique called self-affirmation, can significantly reduce extremism and ideological closed-mindedness. Do you think perhaps there's some way that we could all listen more to each other and affirm each other's basic worth and dignity as a human being?
So that requires us to do that for ourselves first, right? So the nice thing about, the easy thing about self-affirmation is that you do it on your own, right? It's just like sit down and write about a time when you felt proud of yourself for 5 minutes. Just do that, and you'll be a nicer person after you do that. The problem is that it's really hard for us to internalize these really positive ideas about ourselves, and we're not going to be able to treat other people with kindness until we're, it's self-affirmation, until we're treating ourselves with kindness and believing in our own self-worth. And that's a lot, that can be a challenge, and it could be something that leadership could address, right? There could be, a source of, creating a source of pride, creating a source of...
Yeah, healthy pride.
Yeah, outside of the bounds of partisanship. And that is a possible path forward. If there's something we do as Americans that makes us feel good about ourselves, then we may be able to get out of this mess.
We need a really inspirational leader. I feel like I want to run for president of the United States. I know what my message would be of uniting us all as a single species. Anyway, look, you say, quote, I maintain that an electorate that is emotionally engaged and politically activated on behalf of prejudice and misunderstanding is not an electorate that produces positive outcomes. Look, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and offering your wonderful research. It's so timely right now, more so than you probably ever would have imagined or even hoped for. You probably wish your work wasn't so timely.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It's like being an epidemiologist, I'm sure, yes. Right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today on the Psychology Podcast, and all the best with your new book as well.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion below. Also, please add a rating and review of the podcast on iTunes, and subscribe to the Psychology Podcast YouTube channel, as we're really trying to increase our viewership on YouTube. Thanks for being such a great supporter of this podcast, and be sure to tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.